Hello, hello, Mordimers here, and welcome back to Magnus Carlsen Chess Tour Finals, day 3 of the Grand Final. In first game, Magnus Carlsen won in the very solid way, so everybody thought, okay, Magnus is on fire, Magnus, we have, old good Magnus, he gonna crush Hikaru. Then we had the draw, pretty funny draw, both of the players laughed because that was a bit of trolling. Magnus Carlsen draw by threefold repetition, Hikaru Nakamura did that before, however, it at least turned against him. So this is game number 3 where Magnus Carlsen gonna play as black and Hikaru Nakamura gonna play as white. So it's like must-win situation for Hikaru. If it's a draw, then Hikaru has to win as black, what of course is much more difficult. However, keep in mind, I just show you 2 games where Hikaru Nakamura won with black pieces twice against Magnus Carlsen. So, never say never. And yeah, without further ado, let's see what happened on the board. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5 and knight f6. Berlin defense of the Ruy Lopez. And in this match, the third day of the finals, actually it was exclusively Berlin defense because Magnus played the Berlin defense as black, and then Hikaru repeat that in the game number 2. This was the draw, by threefold repetition, and now Magnus Carlsen again, knight f6, Berlin defense. We have d3 by Hikaru Nakamura, bishop c5, and now bishop takes on c6, d takes on c6, knight b to d2, and now castle by Magnus Carlsen. And now the main line here is actually castle. Knight c4 is also possible. Just for your information, knight e5 cannot be taken because queen d4, and this is well-known trap where there is the checkmate on f2 and also the knight is under attack, so black gonna win the piece. So queen e2 by Hikaru Nakamura, so he goes for the sideline defending f2. We have rook e8, now the pawn was under attack, and now knight c4, so pretty normal idea. Knight d7, making a space for the f5 in the future, and also remaneuvering the knight to e6. And we've seen that maneuver already, so we know what's going on. And now bishop d2 is the main line, and Hikaru Nakamura said that Fabiano Caruana inspired him to get against the Berlin defense with the queenside castle. So this is the main idea. However, it indicates that white gonna play the queenside castle, so Hikaru went for h4, switching the moves a bit and asking Magnus, okay, I still can play the kingside castle, maybe with the h4 pawn, maybe slightly less, but it's still possible, and I'm still waiting what to do. But Magnus said, I know what you're gonna do because I played against Fabiano Caruana, and he played a5, and it's quite a novelty. Because the main idea here is b5, and it was played couple of times, and after knight e3, knight f8, pretty standard moves, bishop d2, then a5, and after a4, this is another idea here, a4, then is bishop b6, and this was played couple of times, and it's well-known theory. However, Magnus also switched the moves and he played a5 first. And here Hikaru still waiting with the bishop d2 move and play h5, making a space for the knight, so potentially knight can go to h4 and then support the knight on f5, which is the main idea against the Berlin defense. And now what to play as black, because black would love to actually to bring the knight to e6. However, this pawn is hanging because it's attacked twice, and now f6 is possible. However, it's not really that great from the strategical point of view, because now white gonna castle on the queen side and then bring the rook to g1, and this gonna be a weakness. This pawn gonna be a weakness, can be attacked, the position of the king can be pretty much shattered, and that's gonna be dangerous for black. And black not gonna be as fast with the attack on the queen side probably, so it would be very, very risky in this position. So first we have b5, kicking the knight. knight goes to e3, so as planned, it's gonna go to f5 anyway, but now black can finally goes with the knight to f8 with the plan to go to e6. And now what to play next? That is the question. There are a couple of options. So for example, knight f5 immediately. Black probably would take that knight, and after e takes on f5, there is some, you know, possibility of playing e4. Maybe first prepare that by playing queen d5 and continue. However, white still have the resources like rook h4, and it's well known, you know, resource to control e4, and you know, it always have to keep in mind that this is on the board, but definitely the king and the queen on the same file with the rook, it just doesn't look good. So knight f5 probably not the best idea. Knight h4 would be very interesting. Maybe black would take this knight, or if not, then after knight e6, this knight could land on f5. So it looks pretty interesting for white. Queen g4 can come. Maybe the rook could continue the attack. Who knows? Very interesting. But now Hikaru says, okay, I'm ready for bishop d2, and maybe I'm gonna castle. And Magnus say, knight e6, go for the castle. And now what to play? Castle or don't castle? It looks very scary. So Hikaru Nakamura didn't castle. Also, it looks like this pawn is hanging. However, actually that is a very nice trap set up by Magnus Carlsen. Knight e5 of course cannot be taken because knight d4 with the attack on the queen and attack on the knight, so white would lose the piece. So that's also not possible. And finally, knight f5, the bishop cannot take the knight. It looks pretty good, but now knight f4. And now, okay, this can be taken in the future. Bishop f4. Now e takes on f4, and look at this. This pawn controls g3, so any moves like g4 are not possible, and this is the main idea behind, you know, playing the knight on f5 to give the cover for g4 and then g5 attack. And also this knight is hanging because there is this pawn is actually pinned, so that's also not possible. So Hikaru has, you know, very difficult position, you know, how to continue. A4, this is well-known idea, you've seen that already. And now, believe me or not, Magnus Carlsen spent 7 minutes for his next move, and he was calculating, I'm sure he was calculating the moves like, you know, knight f4. It looks pretty good. However, after queen f1, black has to decide what to do. Can block this pawn, of course, can play very actively f5 and try to crush the position of white. Queen f6 is possible, and so on. So this was possible, but much more interesting would be knight d4. Knight d4 with the attack on the queen, with the attack on the knight, with the attack on c2 as well. So probably knight d4, e takes on d4, and this actually was shown by Yasser Seirawan, that it's very, very interesting because now f5 is possible, and you know, black can try to exploit the queen and the king in the center on the same file. And Peter Leko say, okay, knight d1, and what now? And Yasser said, okay, I didn't see this knight d1, maybe the position is very solid, and they didn't have the time to analyze, you know, it further, but it's very interesting. After f5 and f3, this they found, and they wanted to play something, you know, like knight f2, bishop to go to g3, and so on. However, there is very interesting variation of this line. First take on e4, and then bring the bishop and attack on g3. So knight f2, preparing to castle. Now we have rook f8. So the knight is under attack, and castling would be very, very bad idea. B takes on a4, and the position is open. The rook gonna join the attack on the kings, and that's gonna be, you know, just crushing for white. So probably castle on the king side, but now queen h4, and it looks very, very dangerous. The only move actually saving from mate is e5, but then there is rook e8 pinning that pawn, and after, let's say, rook a to e1, there is rook e5, and this is pretty tricky. If the queen moves somewhere, then of course there is the checkmate still on the board on h2. So white would be forced actually to exchange the queen for the rook and the bishop, and yes, white would have this pair of rooks. However, black has also, you know, probably slightly better position, but both sides would have to be very precise, you know, how to continue, and that would be very, very interesting actually. So it was very, very interesting. However, believe me or not, Magnus Carlsen maybe did calculate that. Maybe he thought, okay, it's not good enough. 7 minutes, that's enough for Magnus to calculate a lot. But he came with nobody believed before. And Hikaru said also after the game, like, what? Now the position here is close, so all I have to do is just lock the position, and then I, you know, attack on the king side, and everything is fine. I even if I'm in danger, I can, you know, castle on the queen side, and I'm completely safe over there. The idea behind this is actually, you know, weakens the pawn. But the idea by Magnus behind this is actually intentionally weaken this c4. And that actually most of the players would probably go for knight c4. Because it's, you know, great square for the knight. However, after knight d4, bishop d4, you know, this pawn is under attack. Then the bishop can come also to e6, eliminate the knight, and it can be very, very tricky here. Maybe white would have to play something like c3, and after exchanging the pieces, you know, there is the open b file, and it can be very dangerous for white as well. The king is still in the center, so probably, I'm not really sure if it could, you know, go for the short castle or not. It looks, you know, pretty dangerous for white. However, Hikaru thought, okay, if c4 is free, that's probably gonna work in favor of Magnus, so let's just seal all of the position. b3, and now I have very healthy, very strong pawn structure. And what you gonna do, Magnus? And Magnus said, okay, bishop a6, and it looks, you know, also pretty interesting. But what is the idea? Where is the idea? So first idea is bring the knight to f4, and attack the d3, sacrifice the piece for 2 pawns, and that's gonna be, you know, very dangerous attack on the king, because queen is watching at d3 and gonna support the another minor piece here. So it looks like very dangerous attack. So Hikaru said, okay, I solidify my position g3, so the knight cannot jump to f4, but now Magnus say, okay, this knight gonna go to f5, so now it's the last moment to exchange for the bishop. So actually he gives up the pair of bishops, because this knight gonna be the monster knight on the f5. So we have bishop e3, and now f5. So finally this pin start to work. Now this is pretty dangerous stuff. And now how to answer as white. If white actually takes on e5, it's not really great, because knight d4 with the attack on the queen again. This time probably that would not be the greatest idea to take the knight, because the rook is still on this, you know, open file. This time that would be open file, very dangerous. But after queen d1, still keeping an eye on the knight and on the pawn. Then there is knight f5, and the attack is very strong against a white position. So this actually is not even possible. However, Hikaru Nakamura knows this position very well. Rook h4. So just bring this resource I show you at the beginning of the game. This is well-known resource. So e4 now is defended, but now Magnus have f4, so he is attacking the position and trying to, you know, break through. And now again, g takes on f4 isn't that great, because after e takes on f4, bishop on f4, there is knight d4 again. Attacking the knight, and the knight is actually defending the rook, so rook is on h4, so that is the problem. And of course the queen is under attack, so knight d4 is forced, and then queen can take the rook on h4. So this is why Hikaru Nakamura played bishop d2, and now finally we have knight d4 by Magnus Carlsen, so he continued to push. We have knight d4, queen takes on d4, now the rook is under attack, and of course you cannot panic and, you know, play anything like castle, because that would be a checkmate, that would be pretty funny. But rather rook c1. This was played by Hikaru Nakamura, and now we have f takes on g3, f takes on g3. So Magnus just simply want to pick up the pawn and go to the endgame. We have queen to g1 with check, queen f1, queen g3 with check, queen f2, and now the queen has nowhere to go. All the squares around are controlled by white, so the exchange of the queens is forced. So queen f2, king f2, and now rook e6, controlling the 6th rank, and also preparing to double the rooks on the f file. We have rook g1, so Hikaru Nakamura wants to attack the position of the king with the h6, and he doesn't want actually this pawn to take on h6. He wants to keep the pawn on h6, which sometimes, you know, can be very, very annoying, and is on the dark square, so it always can be protected by the bishop. We have rook f8 with check, king e1, king e2 was also possible, however Hikaru didn't want to have the king on the same diagonal. Remember, this is, you know, rapid time control, so you don't want to always calculate the possibilities of you know, taking the pawn on e4. And now it's quite critical moment of the game, because we have the, you know, dark square bishop and light square bishop, opposite colors of the bishops, and black has the pawns on the dark squares, and it seems that the black can actually, after exchanging the rooks, can bring the bishop and attack these pawns quite easily, while that's gonna be problematic for black, because how to access c2, it looks like very, very difficult task. So probably c5 was the last moment where black could play something like c5, and after, let's say, rook h to g4 with some attacking ideas, rook f7, and then after h6, g6, maybe bishop g5, playing against this, you know, doubling the rook on the f file, and then c4. And the idea is, if white would take with this pawn, then white would have the weakness on a4, and if with this pawn, then of course the weakness is on e4. So that is the idea. If don't take any, then of course black gonna take the pawn, and there gonna be two weaknesses on the b3 and d3. But Magnus has a different idea, bishop c8, so he wants to release the bishop maybe somewhere here once the rooks are exchanged or something. We have h6 by Hikaru Nakamura, g6, and now bishop g5. So black cannot double the rooks on the f file. We have rook e to e8, Magnus tries to do it this way, but now we have rook h2, and Hikaru Nakamura is on time to prevent that. Rook f3, preparing to double the rooks, and now rook f2. And here Magnus could go probably for rook h3, and after, you know, rook are doubled on the f file, go with the bishop e6, and this bishop gonna control f7, and it cannot be removed. White doesn't have any pieces to actually remove that. And also the rook cannot be attacked easily. If the king goes somewhere there, then the rook always can go to h5, and it's completely safe over there. So no problem. However, Magnus, you know, makes things easier for Hikaru, and he exchanged the rooks. So we have rook f2, king f2, rook f8, king e3, and now, believe me or not, but Magnus even exchange another rook. And this was very widely commented that this is the huge blunder, but what are other options? C5 playing immediately is quite late because of the bishop attacking the rook and attacking the pawn on C5, so it doesn't really, you know, work. Maybe rook E8 taking under control, you know, E7. However, bishop F6 with the idea of, you know, taking the pawn on E5 could be quite strong. So king F7 would be forced, and after, let's say, rook F1, so changing the plans a bit. If king goes to the center, king E6, the problem is after bishop G5, the rook can enter the position. So probably king D6. Making some space for the rook, for example, but there is still rook F7. And now rook E7 is not possible because bishop controls here. The rook, of course, attack H7 and also C7, so that is a huge problem. And after rook H8, bishop F6, and the rook is under attack, so probably king E6, and after exchanging the rooks, this bishop gonna take on E5, then gonna take this pawn, this pawn, this pawn, and it's game over. So it's not possible. If king G8, it's slightly better, but it's still, you know, bishop G7. C5 now is of course possible, however rook G1 with the same plan. And after c4, let's say d takes on c4. This weakness is defended by the king. So after king f7, rook g5, and this pawn gonna fall, and white should have you know, quite easy game because this pawn also gonna fall, and so on. So it's very difficult actually to give any advice to Magnus Carlsen. He played king f7, but okay, it is a blunder, but the position is already very, very difficult. Rook f1 by Hikaru Nakamura, of course, king e8, exchanging the rooks, and now bishop d8 going after the pawn on c7. And as you see, these pawns are completely vulnerable. We have c5 now by Magnus Carlsen, and now bishop c7. So now both of the pawns are under attack. We have king e7, and now bishop a5 probably would be slightly better, but Hikaru takes the central pawn, and then he has the first passed pawn in the center. And now king d7 was played by Magnus. Probably he could go for king d8. The point is that the bishop wants to take another pawn here, so definitely c7 should be protected. But king d7 actually blocks the bishop. King d8 probably would be better because after, let's say, bishop d6, there is always bishop g4, and after bishop c5, let's say king c7, so another pawns cannot fall. Then let's say d4, white gonna push the pawns. There is always bishop d1, and after king d2, that could be, you know, threefold repetition. Or white would have to play something like e5. But then black also can push the pawn, this g5 pawn, because the king is in the center, so it's possible, why not? Maybe bishop e7 going after that pawn, maybe to h4, so g4, bishop h4, and after king c6, maybe even black could hold. It would be difficult, but this is the only, you know, counterplay Magnus Carlsen could have. Probably c4, bringing, you know, some extra attack. That would be three connected passed pawns, so that would be forced. King c3, and then king d5, and this king can stay over there. But still, bishop f2, you know, controlling d4, and now the king is free. Maybe bishop e4, b4, a takes on b4, king b4, and yes, there is possibility of, you know, pushing the pawn just to take this pawn, but this pawn gonna be protected. There is another pawn, and king has a lot of time to get and try to also get to h7, which can be protected by the bishop. However, then 2 pawns, probably king cannot, you know, hold both of them. So it should be still winning for white, but black could give some resistance. However, after king d7, this bishop, you know, cannot enter the game. We have bishop f6 by Hikaru Nakamura, and now Magnus Carlsen waits with the bishop. So bishop b7, king f4, and now we have bishop c6, and in this position Magnus Carlsen, after playing bishop c6, he resigned. And he resigned because Hikaru can, you know, enter to the game, to the center, to e5, and now the king controls d6. If the king is moved, then the king also gonna come to d6 and pick up the pawns and win the game. And if the king stays there, then of course we have bishop g5, and the king go, you know, after the h7 pawn, and that's also winning. So let's say king e8, king f6, king f8, so king is on time, but now e5, and this pawn gonna march and win the game. So this is why Magnus Carlsen resigned after playing bishop c6. However, one of my subscribers wrote in my last video that there was some interesting idea. I haven't found that idea and the discussion about that, that king e8 could be drawing. It looks like, you know, Stockfish likes the position of white. It's still winning for white, but after a couple of moves, it should be a draw. And I couldn't find this idea, and I also tried to analyze it a bit, and I couldn't find it. But let's try. Let's give it a short shot. So for example, bishop h4, going after this pawn this way, so that makes some sense. So after king d7, bishop f2, king d6, d4, exchanging the pawns, because why not? C takes on d4, bishop d4, and black gonna lose, first exchange this pawn, and then this pawn is vulnerable, gonna you know, fall. So white gonna have 2 connected passed pawns, so that's the first idea. Black could actually push this pawn, and it cannot be taken because of course white would enter the game and pick up all the pawns, so that's you know, in favor of black. So king f5 would be forced, and then just, you know, this pawn can march, so g4, but white still can continue. c3, b takes on c3, bishop takes on c3, g3, still march.